Maxim Schreier. I'm a professor at Boston College, and I have the great pleasure of directing this seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center at Harvard University. And before I introduce our guest, Professor Marat Greenberg from Reed College, I just want to make a few acknowledgements and mention some of the events we have been having this spring. First of all, the programs are sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard and, of course, the Davis Center. And I want to express a special appreciation for Laura Sargent and her colleagues for making all of this possible. We had very interesting events this season. We had a talk by Yohanan Petrovsky Shtern, who spoke about minorities in the context of the war in Ukraine, not just the Jews of Ukraine, but other minorities. And then we had a fascinating talk by Julia Rigel, who spoke about music in the Warsaw Ghetto, but also made other far-reaching connections with other cultures produced during periods of war and genocide. And finally, today, we have this absolutely fascinating talk by Marat Greenberg, whom I'm very happy to welcome as a great scholar and as a great friend. Marat Greenberg was born in Ukraine and emigrated to the United States in 1993. He studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia University before receiving his PhD at the University of Chicago. He's a scholar of Jewish and Russian literature and culture and of cinema, and is a professor of Russian and humanities at Reed College in Oregon. Greenberg is the author of a number of books. Until recently, I would have said he's most famous for his book, I Am to Be Read, not from left to right, but in Jewish, from right to left, The Poetics of Baris Strugatsky, his book from 2011, which also came out in Russian translation in 2020. But there's a little more to tell here. Marat has also published a book about Alexander Askoldov, his film, The Commissar. He also co-edited a fascinating collection, Woody on Rye, Jewishness in the Films and Plays of Woody Allen. His essays recently have been appearing in Tablet Magazine, Mosaic, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And he lectures widely, and of course, we will have the pleasure of hearing him today, lectures widely on topics ranging from Shoah literature and film to Jewish Russian poetry. And now the big announcement, which is that we are to congratulate Professor Greenberg on the recent publication of his wonderful new book, The Jewish Soviet Bookshelf, Jewish Culture and Identity Between the Lines, which was published by Brandeis University Press in conjunction with the Tauber Institute, their series for the study of European Jewry. I should also mention that some time ago, Marat came and spoke to us in this seminar when he was just beginning to work on this book, and now the book is out. So many congratulations. And finally, Marat is working on two new book projects. One is an annotated translation of Mikhail Goldis's book, Memoirs of a Jewish Public Prosecutor from Soviet Ukraine, and a study of Jewishness in Russian, Ukrainian, and East European science fiction in the Soviet era. And today's talk, which is titled The Strugatskys and Beyond, the Secret Jewish Language of Soviet era science fiction, is an installment of this fascinating new project. Marat, welcome. It's very good to have you.
Thank you, Maxim. It's wonderful to be here. And as Maxim mentioned, I think in 2016, I gave a talk on the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, and just a few short 6 or 7 years later, the book is out. So that's a good sign. So hopefully maybe this talk will play a similar role, and in a few years, I'll be able to present my book on Jewishness in Soviet and East European science fiction. Before I start, let me share my my slides, and And I hope everybody can see them. Yes?
Yes, great.
Okay, wonderful. So I will talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then I'll be happy to answer questions, and hopefully we'll have many questions. That's always wonderful. So this project, in a sense, comes out of my this recent book that Maxim talked about, the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, and it really is an extension of that project. There's a chapter in my Soviet Jewish bookshelf book on the Strugatsky brothers, about whom I will talk a little bit today. But this is really kind of moving beyond the Strugatskys and exploring this incredibly rich world of Soviet and East European, particularly Polish science fiction, and the enormous Jewish layers within that world, which I think really need to be uncovered. So I'm going to start. Science fiction played an outsized role in Soviet literature and culture, especially in the post-Stalinist periods. As with other literary genres, visual art, music, and cinema, its renaissance began during the Thaw epoch as part of liberalizing reforms initiated by Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death. On the one hand, science fiction suited well the politics of Cold War and space race, and was thus promoted by the regime. But on the other, it became a refuge for first optimistic about the possibility of change, and later skeptical, disgruntled, and disaffected intellectuals. With their, what was called in Russian, scientific fantastical, научная фантастика, volumes, they reached back to the fantastical tradition of Russian literature, from Nikolai Gogol to Fyodor Dostoevsky to Mikhail Bulgakov, and built a bridge between Soviet and Western, especially American, works of science fiction. As a genre, science fiction has allegory and coding implanted into its backbone. It is thus not surprising that it became a safe space for both writers and their readers, where subversion and writing and reading between the lines would flourish. So the period that I'm concentrating on, or at least I'm starting with, is the period of the Thaw, from mid 1950s or really early 1960s and on. As I mentioned, the period of this Thaw liberalization, kind of very optimistic about science fiction because of the topics that had to do with space race, and of course, which then had to do with Cold War politics. But there were other reasons. So the question that I'm asking is, why does science fiction become cool in this period? And of course, it is the Thaw that I mentioned, but also translations of American sci-fi, of which there were so many by the classics of, by the most prominent American sci-fi writers of that period, be it Ray Bradbury, be it Isaac Asimov, be it Heinlein, but also others. There's also a rediscovery of banned and forgotten authors, and Mikhail Bulgakov is particularly important here. Number of what we can consider his sci-fi works, such as The Heart of a Dog, for instance, were not published, but of course Master and Margarita, which has a fantastical element at its core, or a fantasy element at its core, becomes a huge event of the Thaw when it is finally published. Also, there is a link between the literature, sci-fi literature, and cinema. And we can talk a lot about the films that come out during this period, but of course the name of Andrei Tarkovsky looms large in this regard because of his sci-fi films, and Solaris and Stalker in particular. Solaris probably really interesting in this regard because of Stanisław Lem, about whom I will talk just in a few minutes later. And as I said, science fiction becomes this niche, or to use the contemporary term, safe space for liberal intelligentsia, along with other spaces. For instance, animation provided such a niche, translation provided another niche, and because of the very nature of sci-fi, allegory, subversion, is where it's so prominent. It especially appeals to these Soviet intellectuals, and also religion. Sci-fi becomes a place through which religion can be can be talked about, and Jewishness. Yeah, and Jewishness. And here we have on this slide we have a poster from a prominent film from that year, one of the more optimistic films, Дорога к звездам, right? Path to the stars. So with that kind of general background, let's turn to this question of Jewishness, yeah, and Jews in Soviet science fiction. Just to show you this other slide. So as I said, so 1960s, you have a number of series that are established in science fiction that come out every year, which includes works by the young Soviet sci-fi authors, some of whom I'll be talking about today, but also translations of American sci-fi. And all of this coalesces around the press, Молодая гвардия, the young guard. Interestingly, the press that would become very, very conservative later on, and even anti-Semitic to some extent. Here in the 1960s, it becomes this gathering place for these kind of radical sci-fi authors, and they were putting out these volumes every year. And here you can see it from 1962, 63, and 64 with these really wonderful, cool illustrations. So Jews were prominent in the Soviet science fiction world for reasons both similar and distinct. Living in the country where officially anti-Semitism did not exist and Jews were recognized as a separate ethnicity, but in reality, all manifestations of Jewishness were consistently erased and persecution flourished, science fiction often became the locus of rare, explicit Jewishness and widespread subterranean expression. Indeed, due to both the personalities involved and the content of their writings, it wouldn't be a stretch to think of Soviet science fiction as a Jewish art form in some central ways, which makes it deeply original, if not unique, in the 20th century annals of the genre. And let's just look at this list. So I was putting this list, and it's not a complete list, but just so we can appreciate how many Jews were sci-fi authors. Of course, the Strugatsky brothers, right? The Strugatsky brothers, Ilya Varshavsky, Gennady Gor, and I will talk about them in particular today. Georgy Gurevich, an interesting sci-fi author who was also sort of a scholar of science fiction and putting out these kind of popular histories of science fiction, wrote a pretty interesting book on science fiction cinema. Rafail Nudelman, a fascinating person who later immigrates to Israel in the 1970s and becomes one of the key players in the kind of Russian intellectual scene in Israel. Nudelman himself was a fascinating sci-fi author. He was also a prolific translator, translating in particular Stanisław Lem from Polish into Russian. And Nudelman was also a theoretician of science fiction. Yeah, and there is this really interesting link about which I write in my Soviet Jewish bookshelf. There is that link between the world of Soviet Jewry and those who later end up in immigration, particularly in Israel. When in Israel, Nudelman begins to translate from Hebrew and becomes a translator of the wonderful Israeli writer Meir Shalev, who just passed away just a few days ago. Yeah, I think last week. There were also that in tandem, this Evgeny Vaiskunsky and Isai Lukadyanov, cousins, also Jewish. Yeah, Genrikh Altov, a fascinating sci-fi writer, but also real scientist. Yeah, with some kind of pretty radical ideas that live that are alive today when we talk about AI and things like that. A slightly later generation, Alexander Mirer, who later also becomes a scholar of Bulgakov and writes interesting works about Master Margarita and Bulgakov's use of scripture. And Boris Shtern. Very interesting writer who wrote both in Russian and Ukrainian, and wrote this massive novel in the late 80s called Ethiopian Man. Is this fascinating work that in a way is a commentary on the entirety of Russian and world literature with some fascinating Jewish elements. So what is interesting about this list, it's not just that these writers happen to be Jewish, but that pretty much in each of their works, we can find some very, very interesting manifestations of Jewishness, commentary on Jewishness. Yeah, and what is also interesting, and just like it's true of the kind of the place of Jewishness in Soviet literature in general, where non-Jews happen to play a major role. I'm thinking of somebody like Konstantin Paustovsky or Anatoly Kuznetsov or a number of other figures. In this case, it is also the case, as we will see at the end of my talk, that it is a non-Jewish writer, Ariadna Gromova, who looms large in this regard. Yeah. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the Strugatsky brothers because I have written on them a lot already, and again there is a chapter on them in my book on the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. But of course, they became the most important science fiction authors from the 1960s and on, and made Jewishness one of the richest and most ubiquitous parts of their multi-volume oeuvre. I'll quote a wonderful scholar of science fiction and a science fiction writer in her own right, Ilana Gomil, who says, the true speakers of the Russian Jewish intelligentsia for several generations, and their work becoming the Bible of Russian Jewry, according to her, and I completely concur. There is hardly a significant Strugatsky's work that does not address Jewishness in either a veiled or a direct way, from episodic and central characters to biblical, Talmudic, and Kabbalistic allusions to the commentary on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. So here are the Strugatsky brothers. And of course, it is also interesting, and that's sort of indicative of general kind of trends within Soviet literature, Russian literature when it comes to Jewishness. Strugatsky themselves, of course, never talked openly about this very prominent place of Jewishness in their works. And actually later, after Arkady's death, the older brother's death, Baris, in the early 90s during Perestroika, wrote an essay on sort of the Jewish questions, which completely diminished the place of Jewishness in their work. And it's an interesting case of kind of a sort of a blindness, the blindness that the authors themselves had toward their work, and I discuss it in my book as well. Before we jump more into this world of Soviet sci-fi, let me mention this other writer who looms very, very large, and that's Stanisław Lem, a Polish sci-fi author, perhaps arguably the most important sci-fi author of the second half of the 20th century. So Lem was idealized and idolized in the Soviet Union. His works were published and translated in many editions. And he really served as a guru for these sci-fi authors. Yeah. So here on this wonderful picture. So this is during Lem's visit to Leningrad, I believe in 1962. And here we have some of the characters that I'll be talking about today. So here is Lem. Here we have Arkady Strugatsky. Here we have Ilya Varshavsky, about whom I'll be talking in just a minute. Here's Ariadna Gromova, this non-Jewish author, but who is absolutely central in this context. I'm going to talk about her at the end of our talk. And this is Zhuravlyova, another sci-fi author. Now, what is interesting about Lem is that Lem was Jewish and really kept that fact sort of under wraps for the entirety of his life for various reasons, political and other reasons, but also sort of deeply personal. And those had to do with his experience during the war. Lem was born in Lviv, in Lemberg, in Lvov, yeah, and survived during the occupation, both first the Soviet occupation, then the Nazi occupation. We still don't know exactly how he survived, most likely with sort of kind of forged documents. And his novels, his works are replete, as we can now see and really begin to appreciate, replete with these allusions to the Holocaust. And there is some work that has been done on that, but it's also really interesting. And I'm just now beginning to think about that and write about that. Kind of thoughts about God, religion, and Judaism are at the center of Lem's novels. It's interesting. Rafail Nudelman, this writer that I just mentioned, who was a translator of Lem's works into Russian during the Soviet period, who was also a friend of Lem. There's a fascinating correspondence between the two. He later, when he was already in Israel, and continued to publish Lem, by the way, in Russian, in his periodical that he was editing in Israel, this wonderful journal called 22. He wrote an essay on Lem where he chose the idea of labyrinth and masks as kind of these core elements in Lem's oeuvre, in Lem's worldview, and those, just the very idea of masks, right, kind of has this notion of hiding one's identity, and definitely I think has to do with Jewishness. So I'll just look at some of these works of Lem that again were published in the Soviet Union and that have these very, very interesting Holocaust and Jewish elements. So first, Lem writes this trilogy called Time Not Lost, and it is his non-science fiction trilogy. Some of it he never republished it again because he sort of thought saw it as a compromise with the authorities. There can be socialist, realist elements, but it's a trilogy about the war and the aftermath of the war, that it's parts of which are just fully devoted to the Holocaust. Only one part of that trilogy has been translated into English, and that's the Hospital of Transfiguration. And in its entirety, that trilogy has never been translated into Russian. There are just a few sections from it that have been published recently that have to do with the Holocaust. It's a fascinating work. And then his sci-fi masterpieces, Return from the Stars, which has direct, fascinating allusions to the Holocaust. Eden, and those two works in particular were very, very important for the Strugatsky brothers, and how the Strugatsky brothers embed the Holocaust into their works. His slightly later work, His Master's Voice, translated by Nudelman, that contains probably his only text that contains explicit discussion of the Holocaust, memories of the war, very personal memories of the war for Lem. Now, it's also interesting that when Nudelman translated that work, and it was published in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, the section that had to do with the Holocaust, that explicit section, was deleted. It was not included. Then later, Lem's essay on the Holocaust, Provocation, which Nudelman published in the Russian translation in his journal 22. So these are the works that have to do with the Holocaust. But then his other works were, again, kind of the engagement with Judaism, contemplation of God, are center stage, and that's of course Solaris. Again, it's very, very interesting that Solaris, which would be adapted by Andrei Tarkovsky with the script by Friedrich Gorenstein, which Lem hated. He thought that Tarkovsky and Gorenstein just betrayed completely his intent and everything that he wanted to say in Solaris. In Solaris, there's a fascinating discussion about God with some very, very interesting Kabbalistic innuendos. Now, that section was not included in the first translation of Solaris into Russian that comes out in the early 1960s. It was later included in the later translations that come out in the 70s and 80s. Again, His Master's Voice, which, as I said, has that explicit Holocaust episode, also has fascinating discussions of religion, particularly Judaism. Golem, right? Golem, where Lem imagines this kind of AI that is really kind of has the capacity of God, omniscient God, and he calls it Golem for obviously very specific reasons. And then the non-science fiction work that Lem actually thought that he thought of it as his most interesting work, and that's the memoir about his time in Lviv prior to the war, Polish Lviv, High Castle, where again he obfuscates the kind of the Jewish layers, but it's precisely that erasure, that obfuscation, those absences that are so evocative and present. So kind of Lem, the shadow of Lem, the participation of Lem in all of this is of tremendous importance. And so let me just give you this one quote by Lem. This is what he says later in his correspondence with his English translator, Kendall. And he says, the misfortune of a writer like me is that he either speaks to those who know roughly what he is saying anyway, or to those who do not understand him completely. The former share experiences with the writer, while the latter do not, and that's all. So this is the condition, that's exactly the condition that I discuss in my book on the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, where you kind of have this double layeredness within text. To use Leo Strauss's terminology, you have the kind of the exoteric layer that is open to everybody, and then you have the esoteric layer, the hidden layer that is open to those who can discern it, open to the select to the select few. Yeah, and this is exactly how Lem is discussing it, right? So if he's talking about the Jewish experiences, right? He says those of the readers who know them, who share them, they can locate them, and those who don't. Yeah, and in a sense, the works of the Strugatsky brothers, the younger generation, yeah, tremendously again influenced by Lem, operate in the same way. And I'm not going to talk about the Strugatskys. I'm happy to answer questions about them during the Q&A time, but I'll just mention some of the works where again kind of Jewishness looms large, and I discuss them at length in my book. So first, the Escape Attempt, Попытка к бегству, probably their first really interesting original work, which is essentially a contemplation of the Holocaust. Again, very, very much influenced by Lem. Yeah. We can look at their later work, Ugly Swans, which they already had difficulty publishing. Yeah, and it really appeared in some Izdat. But again, we have these kind of fascinating allusions to anti-Semitism, to the Holocaust, to the Jewish condition in modernity. Monday Starts on Saturday, kind of their sort of happy work, which is also replete with these allusions to Judaism, Kabbalah, yeah, and it's really a contemplation, I think, on Judaism, yeah. They're fascinating in this question of Jews and power, and what happens when Jews come close to power, right? Again, in a society that is generally hostile to them. Their masterpiece, The Snail on the Slope, again, which they had huge difficulty publishing, and the work that they could never publish, The Doomed City, yeah, kind of their opus, yeah, is really about these questions, as well, yeah. So let's jump. I'm mindful of the time. Let's jump to these other writers. Yeah. So the first is Ilya Varshavsky, who was also a fellow Leningrader, just like Boris Strugatsky, who started as a writer in the 1920s. But then starts writing science fiction after the war in the 1960s, and he sort of comes to it serendipitously. He writes here, you know, kind of in an anecdotal fashion. They had an argument with his son, and he said, you know, science fiction is just anybody can do this, and his son said, fine, well, go ahead and write it, yeah. And so Varshavsky did, and that's how he became a science fiction writer. He was deeply prolific, writing only short stories. And there is, again, an anecdote that when Lem came to the Soviet Union, remember that picture that we just saw, and the Strugatskys gave him a notebook filled with Varshavsky stories. Lem read through all of this and said, this is amazing. This contains everything that the American sci-fi is all about. So this covers all the topics and all the themes of American sci-fi, from AI to time travel to kind of the classical tropes of sci-fi. So there are a number of stories, only a few stories in Varshavsky's oeuvre that can have these Jewish elements, but I think they're very symbolic and they're very, very indicative, right? So the first story, and this is one of his earliest stories from the early 1960s, is called The Roby, and it is about this, how a man, most likely modeled on Varshavsky himself, is given a robot as a gift for his birthday. Yeah, and this robot is supposed to sort of take care of everything in the house. So he's kind of like a golem type of a figure. The problem is that instead of being a helper, this golem just turns out to be completely disastrous. Yeah, and his issue is that he just cannot assimilate into this human world, right? A stranger who's trying to assimilate into a new world and spectacularly failing at doing so. Yeah, so I sort of call him kind of this Soviet golem, and of course it is in this perennial Jewish condition, trying to assimilate into another society. Yeah, and trying to adjust. So there's a whole kind of sort of discourse on Jewish language in this story that is only just a couple of pages long. And so in this story, the character, the protagonist, tells a joke at the dinner table, and here's a joke. One traveling salesman meets another on a steamer. "Where are you going?" he asks. "To Odessa," the second replies. Now you say you're going to Odessa so that I think you're not going there. However, you're really going there, so why lie about it? Yeah. So everybody at the table is just laughing. But the robot, the poor Roby, the robot just cannot understand why it's funny. Like, he can't understand. If he says he's going there, if he knows he's going there, why not just say it? Like, what's the joke? And our character tries to explain to him that it is sort of inexplicable. Now, this is clearly, this joke is an example of kind of this absurdist Jewish humor, very much also part of kind of the Odessan Jewish lore. And in Russian, if you read it in Russian, it's clearly, you can see that it sort of comes out of kind of Russian translations of Shalom Aleichem. So Roby writes his own joke based on this model, and again, it just fails, and it just fails completely. Yeah, and by the end of the story, he's still in the house. Yeah, kind of sort of having taken over. Yeah, so this is really, for me, the way that I read this story, and I think the way that some of the readers reading that story back then could read it. This is really a story about the sort of impenetrability of Jewish language. Right, and this is kind of Jewish language. This hidden Jewish language is as something that holds kind of Jewishness together, that conceals Jewishness. So that's one story. Another story by Varshavsky is fascinating, a longer story called "The Loop of Hysteresis." Has to do with time travel, and in that story, a scientist, a historian. The story takes place in 22nd century or something like that. So he's going to kind of the Time Travel Institute, and Time Travel Institutes are sort of a trope in Soviet science fiction. And he comes in and he says that he wants to go back to Palestine of Jesus's time in order to prove that Jesus never existed. Right, and so we have then kind of the process through which he goes. Yeah. And I'll just give you one example, process through which he goes in this institute. So his name is Kurochkin, which is funny in itself. Kurochkin came up to the table and glanced about Kazanov's shoulder, a yellowed painting depicting a man in a long lapserdak with a yarmulke on his head and ancient boots with rubber clasps on his feet. Looks good, right? Kazanov smugly asked. So they're trying to create a costume for him so that he could fit into that ancient Palestinian society. Looks good, right? Kazanov smugly asked. I'm afraid not quite, Kurochkin carefully answered. It seems to me that this is from a somewhat later epoch. Aha, Kazanov again pointed his finger. I know now what you need. Take a look. This time, Kurochkin was presented with the outfit of a Bukharan Jew. This option, however, was also rejected. Yeah, and so, well, it's hilarious, right? It shows again how they're just completely not understanding anything about Jewish history. But also, this text is fascinating. This text published in 1967. It'd be interesting to see exactly when it comes out, before the Six-Day War or after the Six-Day War. But it is just replete with all this Jewish stuff. Yeah. And it's here with this is an original illustration from the first publication of the story. And here they're trying on pay us on Kurochkin to see if he could look like a Jew. Now, what the really fascinating stuff happens when he ends up in Palestine, yeah, and is meeting all these characters from the Gospels, and is trying to sort of communicate with them. First of all, he is talking to them in Aramaic, in Hebrew, yeah, and he starts talking about Jesus in such vivid terms that they actually take him, Kurochkin, to be Jesus, right? So it doesn't seem that there was Jesus, but now there is Jesus in history because of Kurochkin, who goes back in time and changes history. And in that story, there's just kind of a fascinating commentary on scientific atheism, this field of kind of social studies in the Soviet Union. I also discuss in my Soviet Jewish bookshelf book, and how Kurochkin kind of plays with that language and actually makes religion so attractive to them. Kurochkin is crucified, right? And when he is on the cross, he is, zoomed back to his time. So it is a Jewish story through and through, kind of both in terms of the content, but again, also kind of the subversive elements. Yeah. And it's interesting. So Baris Strugatsky, who kind of looked at, Thaw Varshavsky as one of his teachers, and this is what he says, and I think it's very interesting. He says, Strugatsky later on, and still I would dare say that Varshavsky never did write his best work. He was preparing for it, was tormented by it, and waited for it. Many times he would tell me, I'm tired of all this BS. I want to produce something real, something strong. I remember disagreeing with him and trying to argue, but at the same time, I always understood that the master knows best. The true master is always unsatisfied with himself and always right. He searched for a new path, but did not have enough time to find them, did not have enough time. Very, very interesting, right? And I think here, right, kind of there's that sense that had Varshavsky been able really to do what he wanted, then he would have been able to give full force to his Jewish voice, right? And so instead of these episodes, a few really fascinating episodes, but episodes, Jewish episodes that we have scattered through his work, instead we would have an entire body. So Varshavsky, wonderful. He's also a great writer, funny, ironic, and deep at the same time. Let me switch to this other writer, also a fellow Leningrader, again, kind of along with Varshavsky and Baris Strugatsky, and that is Gennady Gor, a writer who's really only recently we've been rediscovering. Yeah, I should mention the work of Paulina Barskova, who writes on the literature of the siege of Leningrad, and particularly has written wonderfully about Gor's poetry. Yeah, so Gor began as a writer in the 1920s. Yeah, he was kind of part of the avant-garde Soviet literary scene, and writes a number of very interesting works. That particularly, his novel Korova, the cow, also a number of short stories that are just grotesque but kind of disembodied characters, and leaves all of that behind because he's just terribly frightened. Yeah, his experiences with the regime, because of Stalinist terror, because of the anti-Semitic campaigns of the post-war period, there are a number of facts from his life that he keeps in complete secret. And again, these are the works that he writes, prior to the war in the 1920s, the people that he knew back then, also the fact that he was Jewish, and his Jewishness is fascinating because as I'll talk about that, he was born in Siberia and received a thorough Jewish education there, and he also keeps as a secret the fact that he was writing poetry after he's evacuated from Leningrad during the siege. And this is the poetry that Barskova and others have written about, a real example of sort of trying to find a new language, a radically new language that could give expression to catastrophe. Yeah, they're horrifying poems, fragmentary, the kind of disembodied language at its core. So thinking about Gor's Jewishness, let me just read to you a little bit. So he writes this memoir, published only once in 1932. It was republished 1990 or so, called "In a Small Freezing Town," в городке Студеном. And it provides this very detailed and evocative memoir of the Jewish milieu in Siberia. His parents were revolutionaries and were imprisoned in Siberia, and he was raised by his grandfather. So he offers a portrait of these pre-Soviet Siberian Jewish communities. Let me give you this is how he describes a synagogue service, which I think kind of combines animalistic and human elements in a visceral, grotesque, and yet endearing manner. So here's a quotation. "In a synagogue built with the money of the gold magnate Sosnovsky, the Jews were buzzing. In the gilded lions opening their maws, I did not find anything animalistic. The walls of the synagogue, dead trees, lost their pine smell. Moisei Zelikovich and his son Boris smelled of molded books, prayer shawls, candle holders, and unwashed skin. In Gor's vision, Jewish life is embedded into the natural world and is presented as a primordial landscape." So another quotation. "The prayer was flowing quietly like a frozen river. The song transformed into a whisper. The Jews got inspired. The old man's movements were not devoid of some strange elegance. The dusk painted the window and gilded decorations with cold beauty." Right? So this beautifully complex and evocative picture. Again, he leaves all of that behind and starts to write science fiction works in the 1960s, which have been completely neglected, even though he was one of the premier science fiction authors of his time, and mainly they've been sort of mentioned as an example of compromise, like this is what Gor needed to do. But as I can see, kind of rediscovering these works, they really were an attempt by Gor to come to terms with the main trauma of his life, what had to do with all these losses, and the Jewish losses in particular, and trying to confront that through the allegories of science fiction. Yeah, the question of memory, the question of time travel, the question of particularly time travel, kind of these prehistoric periods, is one of the main themes in Gor's oeuvre. So I'll mention this: one of his first sci-fi novels, which is called "Докучливый собеседник," which comes out in the early 1960s, 1962. So in English, it's "Exasperating Interlocutor." And it describes the discovery by Soviet archaeologists of a scalp of a humanoid alien who visited the Earth in its prehistoric age. And so the novel has two parts. On the one hand, about the Soviet scientist, yeah, and on the other hand, we have the diary that this alien kept. And as we discover by the end of the novel, it's a novel within a novel, right? A writer, a sci-fi author who's a character in the novel, is writing about this alien. Yeah, I'll just give you a couple of quotations that will show you again how central memory is to this work. So Gor writes, "The individual is mortal, while the robot double," so this alien has a robot double. "The robot double is capable of overcoming time. The recollections remain even when the one who remembers is gone. They're preserved like the books which in remote times were kept in libraries, the spiritual riches which acquired eternity. And thanks to them, in some measure, each individual acquires eternity and can share his individual experience with society," right? So the idea, how can you preserve everything, especially when that past is buried deep in the kind of that traumatic subconscious. There's a character in this book who is a Russian emigre in Paris, right? Who left because of the revolution. His wife is Jewish, yeah, and she is taken by the Gestapo. And this writer is tormented by the fact that he did not join her. So he introduces kind of this explicit Jewish Holocaust element into this seemingly kind of innocuous sci-fi novel. But the main theme, which again runs through Gor's oeuvre, is how do you preserve that world, that part of yourself which you're masking, which you're afraid to show to the world. Yeah. And again, it's interesting to think, just like in Varshavsky's case, had they been able to sort of give full voice to that theme, what we would have on our hands. Another story, I'll mention this other text by Gor, and it's a story, The Boy, which was translated into English way back then. And it's a story, again, about a scientist who discovers this frozen boy who comes from kind of the prehistoric period and contains the entire history, prehistory, and all the memories within himself. So this boy is in this Soviet classroom, and nobody understands him except for one teacher. And that teacher is a teacher of math. His name is Mark Semyonovich. So just the very name indicates that he is Jewish. And then Gor gives us examples of how Mark Semyonovich talks. Yeah, so here's this quotation. I pictured Mark Semyonovich in my mind with a piece of chalk in one hand and the blackboard eraser in the other, figures on the blackboard, and his voice dragging out in his perpetual doubting manner, even when there was nothing to be doubtful about. Look at the Yiddish intonation, right? This voice, the voice of Mark Semyonovich, sat somewhere inside me and argued, let us say, he said, turning to the class, let us say that the existence of the boy's double is known, and we will call it X. Then let us ask ourselves, why should, and it goes on and on. So now to me, this is an example of a pilpul, of a Talmudic discourse, right? That kind of has its own labyrinthine logic, yeah, that again, only the select few can fully appreciate, yeah. Or Mark Semyonovich entered the classroom, drew a right angle triangle on the blackboard, and began to demonstrate the theorem in that doubting toned voice of his, again, that doubting, yeah. Tapping his chalk on the blackboard, he went on demonstrating the theorem as if he himself didn't believe in what he was trying to prove. Of course, it was the fault of the intonation that didn't coordinate with the logical argument that ensued from the demonstration. Again, yeah, this is pure Talmudic sort of logic or lack of logic, yeah, or that says one thing, or here kind of the math problem ensconced within kind of this Talmudic language, yeah. The interesting thing is that Gor knew it well, because Gor was educated in the Hebrew gymnasium in Siberia, so he learned. So he received kind of an early Zionist education, including learning Hebrew, but was also exposed to this world, to the traditional world, so the traditional world of Judaism. And so it is this kind of this Yiddish, this math teacher with his Yiddish intonation, with his Talmudic logic, who can understand this boy that contains the entirety of the worlds within him and his memories. Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. Which shows that again, with Gor we have sort of a Jewish writer on our hands. Yeah, that uses science fiction to these fascinating ends. So the last writer that I'll mention, and I'll just speak for just a few more minutes. And this is a recent discovery for me. So I'm just working on this, and I'm really excited about this. Yeah, and that's Ariadna Gromova. So we saw her on the picture back with Lem. Gromova was a sci-fi author, yeah, who wrote in tandem a number of her novels, wrote in tandem with Rafail Nudelman. Again, this writer who translated Lem and then later immigrated to Israel. They wrote these two very interesting works together. The first is called Investigation in the Institute of Time. So here's an illustration from that. В Институте времени идет расследование, which is essentially, those of you who are fans of the Marvel universe, and and kind of the the idea of parallel universes there. That's exactly what we have here. That's exactly what we have in this novel. It's also interesting that the two main characters there are modeled on the Strugatsky brothers, in some pretty kind of sort of ironic portrait, I have to say. Yeah. And another novel that she writes together with Nudelman is Universe Behind the Corner, very much kind of influenced by Lem, about another world encroaching on our world, and as a result of that, kind of pushing our world out, so that our world is shrinking and disappearing. But in that novel, there is also a fascinating discussion about God. Yeah. So fascinating. But what is really interesting about Gromova is that Gromova was a Holocaust writer. And a Holocaust writer that we sort of either did not know about or forgot about. She was born in Kiev. And already she studied at the Kiev University and was in charge of a literary circle, a literary seminar, where a number of poets who would become prominent poets later on, like Naum Karjavin, for instance, they were part of this seminar. She was not Jewish. She was married to a Jew, Boris Gromov, who was killed at Babin Yar. Killed at Babin Yar, even though he had forged documents, but he was betrayed by their neighbor and killed at Babin Yar. And that left a that transformed Gromova's entire life. She joined in the underground, in the resistance in Kiev, and we don't really have the full details. And I hope that when we're able to access the Russian archives again, I can find that information. She was imprisoned a number of times in the Nazi camps, and she was actually on the train to Auschwitz, from which she escaped. Again, we don't know the details. So she writes this book, which comes out in the 1950s, Linia Front na Vostoki, Eastern Front, which describes Kiev under occupation, and that has chapters devoted to Babin Yar. This is before all the other works that would start, that would talk about it. This book also had a second section, which she was not able to publish because, according to some memoirs, she talks explicitly about the behavior of the local population and their attitude and their help, assistance in the Nazi extermination. But what is also really interesting, that one of the main characters in this novel is somebody who is very much modeled on Gromova, a non-Jewish woman who's married to a Jew who dies at Babin Yar, and how it completely devastates her. So kind of Babin Yar and what happens to Jews is going to be a running thread through this novel. And by the end of the book, she commits suicide. Because she just cannot bear. Now, it's also uncertain, but according to Rafail Nudelman and Stanisław Lem, Gromova also committed suicide. And then she writes this novel, sci-fi novel, which comes out in the 1960s, I think 1967 or 66, called In the Circle of Light, В круге света, which is about a member of the French resistance, which takes place after the apocalypse, right? So the world, there's been a disaster, the world has ended, and the protagonist is a member of the French resistance during the war who was in Auschwitz, and non-Jewish, who's completely changed, transformed by his experience in the camp, and who has these telepathic powers. And so he creates this circle of light where he includes only those who are closest to him and trying to save them by keeping them within that circle. So the entirety of the novel is essentially, it's a Holocaust novel that gives us what we call the camp universe, and the trauma that leaves the survivors with. What we discover by the end of the novel is that, in fact, this character is under hypnosis himself, right? So his friend who was in the camp with him, who was in Auschwitz with him, he puts him under hypnosis in order to kind of return him to the camp, and in order to force him to stop creating this circle of life, because he sees it as just too despotic. So fascinating novel, a Holocaust novel purely. What is interesting is that I think there are some fascinating parallels between how Gromova's novel discusses Auschwitz, camp universe, the condition of being in the post-Auschwitz universe, and the work of Charlotte Delbo, right? This French writer who was part of the French resistance, a non-Jewish woman who was taken to Auschwitz, and later wrote this fascinating sort of memoir that is half poetry, half prose. The way that Delbo talks about the camp universe, yeah, and she talks about sort of the skin of memory that leaves, and she distinguishes between kind of simple memories and deep memories. Yeah, Delbo also talks about dreams as kind of the only state where that deep memory, that camp self, can really come out, which is similar to sort of the idea of hypnosis in Gromova's work. Now, Delbo was not translated into Russian, but I wonder, and again, perhaps the archival work will later be able to yield some results, especially because Gromova's novel has French characters, takes place in France. Perhaps she had access to Delbo's text, which was published for the first time, and I think in 1965. Yeah, because the ideas of post-trauma, kind of the reenactment of camp, and also how one responds to the horror of the Holocaust. Yeah, as sort of Gromova says at the end of her novel, has humanity been radically transformed by the camp? And she says, not really. Man remains man, but everything has gotten more complicated after the camp. Yeah, so they run in these kind of parallel directions, Delbo's text and Gromova's text. And even if Gromova really did not know Delbo, then that makes it even more fascinating that she was able to create this text that can absolutely be included in the canon of Holocaust fiction. Yeah, and again, using science fiction framework for that. So I'm going to stop here. Yeah, so I hope I gave you some taste of kind of the incredible richness of this world of Soviet Polish science fiction and this absolute central place of Jewishness and the Holocaust within it. And I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marat. So maybe you could close your slides and we will continue with the questions. So while the questions are being transferred to the chat, I wonder, and thank you again, this was truly fascinating. And also you spoke with such passion that I can see that you are really, really, really excited about this. I want to pose a question, in no way a challenge, but just a hypothetical. As you yourself know, and you mentioned it, the native Russian language grounds have known science fiction or fantasy since the Romantic period. In fact, there are already very prominent works by Pogorelsky, Adoevsky, by Bestuzhev-Marlinsky, and then, of course, there's a major explosion. I suggest we go straight from there to the 1920s, the real explosion of what we could call early Soviet science fiction with Alexei Tolstoy and with Belyaev. So basically, these are major works. But as I understand, and please correct me if that's not the case, while there are already major Jewish voices, some of the top echelon Jewish Soviet writers like Isaac Babel or Ehrenberg, who are, who have national fame and acclaim. I don't believe there are a lot of Jews working in science fiction in the 1920s. And then, so if we follow kind of the implicit logic of your argument, the real explosion of Jewish creativity in sci-fi and fantasy occurs after the death of Stalin, and it has a kind of post-Stalinist, but also post-Shoah significance. And if that's the case, what is the lesson learned there?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and kind of about the sort of the trajectory, right, in this development and sort of literary historiography, and I'm sort of thinking through these questions as I'm writing and thinking about this project. And yes, I think you're right. This explosion happens during the Thaw, and there are clear kind of cultural and political reasons for that. But these writers, like the Strugatskys, like Gor, who again who is really part of that 1920s milieu, yeah, they're very much conscious of their predecessors. Yeah, their predecessors in the 1920s, as I said, kind of the rediscovery of writers like Mikhail Bulgakov, right, whose Master and Margarita is tremendously influential for all of them. I mean, later on, the Strugatsky sort of write a number of works that try to imitate, to some extent, Master and Margarita, and really going back to the earlier writings like Platonov. Platonov is tremendously important for the Strugatskys. He's tremendously important for Gor. Gor writes this really, really interesting essay about Platonov that is included in one of the last books that he publishes. I think it's the early 80s, right, where he's sort of trying to resurrect Platonov and his and his importance. So there is a definite, and that's, I think, what makes Soviet science fiction so interesting. These modernist roots of Russian literature, avant-garde Soviet roots that they have, and of course going back to the 19th century, right? You mentioned something like Dostoevsky, but of course Gogol, right? Or Saltykov-Shchedrin, for that matter, right? We can look at some of his works as sort of, some sci-fi in some sense. So that's the tradition from which they're working. But it's interesting, it's fascinating that they're infusing that tradition with these Jewish elements, right? And of course, the Holocaust and the position of the Jew in the Soviet Union helps with that, but also their fascination with religious questions, and Judaism, right? And it still hasn't been, I think, apart from me, maybe Denis Sobolev, in Israel also kind of really appreciates these Jewish and Judaic layers within the Strugatskys oeuvre, right? But if you think about, Monday Begins on Saturday, this cult novel, early 1960s, that's supposed to kind of embody the spirit of the 60s. This novel that talks about the rabbi in the creation of Golem, and that's at the center of the novel. I mean, it's just, let's just stop for a second and think that's what the Soviet readers are reading. Millions of them. A novel about Ben Bezalel and his creation of the Golem, and what all of that means. I should also mention that there's kind of very clear distinction in the Soviet context between what's called naучная fantastika, kind of the hardcore sci-fi that is rooted in science and that the regime looked favorably upon, at least in theory, and then of course the idea of fantasy.
Correct.
Yeah, which is so widespread in the Western context. Yeah, although not in the Jewish context. My friend Michael Weingart wrote an essay quite a few years ago, where he was posing the question, why is there no Jewish fantasy? Where's kind of the Jewish Lord of the Rings? He has since sort of, adjusted his view and been working on this, on a book about this now. But the question of sort of fantasy genre is problematic in the Jewish context, and it's problematic in the Soviet context, right? So this one writer that I mentioned, Gurevich, who was sort of a theoretician of sci-fi and was writing these popular works about the history of sci-fi. So in his book about sci-fi and sci-fi cinema, published in the early 60s, he says, fantasy is okay. And he actually says, we shouldn't just think about sci-fi as rooted in science. Yeah. And he makes the case very moderately and considering censorship, but that the roots of sci-fi actually do reach back to these avant-garde works and to fantasy, right? And he says, let's use these terms: научная фантастика for the good, hardcore sci-fi, and ненаучная фантастика, right? Non-scientific, fantastical works, which is essentially his term for fantasy. Right. So all of these come together. Although to somebody like Lem, who hated American sci-fi by and large, but to him, this idea of fantasy and kind of non-hardcore sci-fi was absolutely abhorrent. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I also hear, by the way, Marat, do you agree or not that Lem would hear in Golem a secret pun on Go Lem? I think they all did. just occurred to me, because I think it's kind of like go Lem, meaning
Right,
basically
right.
we are writing in your tradition.
Yes,
But
yes.
what I hear strongly in your discussion of Strugatsky's novels, Gromova's work, Les Gor's work, is that these are post-Shoah works, and that they speak, of course, about genocide, but also, and I kind of wanted to press you a little bit on that, the question of collaboration. For instance, in Trudno быть Bogom, what's the standard English translation of Trudno быть Bogom?
Hard to be a god. Yeah.
Hard to be a god. I feel like the question of collaboration is very central, and sort of your presentation made me think again about how they are channeling these questions through science fiction, precisely because they're not open in other public realms in Soviet culture or in East European culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, they're really, yeah, science fiction, as I said, becomes a niche, but particularly for the Strugatskys, it becomes a place to explore the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
All the kind of the thorny issues that that surround it. That they take a lot of that from Lem. And the way that they do it is, kind of what I talk about in my book, in the sense of, multi-directional memories, right? When all these contexts converge, right? Where you have the Gulag trauma piling up on top of the Holocaust trauma, piling up on top, let's say again, collaboration, or return of Stalinism, at the end of the Thaw, or all of these things coming together. And again, it's interesting, for instance, to somebody like Lem, who respected the Strugatskys a lot, but he did think that they sort of, the way that they absorb that immediate context into their works, he did not think too highly about that, because he felt that was, in a sense, a cop-out, right? And instead of really probing these deep philosophical questions, which I think they do as well, right? But there are these kind of different responses. And Rafail Nudelman, who is thinking about both and kind of theorizing about both the Strugatskys and about Lem in the middle, and his thoughts are particularly interesting in this regard. And again, Gromova, who, a woman that they did not think too highly about.
I think that's an absolutely fascinating discovery, Marat, and I hope to talk to you more about it in person. But I should also mention, then we have two very interesting questions that are waiting to be asked and answered. In the book that you and I both contributed to, which is about to come out, the volume on Russian-Israeli literature, which Roman Kosman of Bar-Ilan and I co-edited, there is a separate chapter by Yelena Rimon, which is a very detailed overview of science fiction and fantasy in Israel, written in the Russian language. And of course, it talks about Nudelman, but so many others.
Yes, and I'll be at Bar-Ilan absolutely with you in June, speaking about Nudelman and Lem.
Absolutely. So now we have great questions. This one coming from Amy Mitchell. Other than Tarkovsky's version of Solaris, were any other of these works adapted into film, movies, etc.?
So in terms of the writers that I mentioned, no. Right. So there are, of course, other adaptations of Lem's novels done, in East Germany, done in Czechoslovakia, done in the United States later on, and of course the other adaptation of Solaris in Hollywood. But now I'm just trying to think. No, some of these writers were involved, in some of the scripts for the sci-fi films. But no, not Gromova, no. So kind of Tarkovsky's adaptation of Solaris, at the same time, I mean, the world of sci-fi cinema was rich and diverse, both in terms of kind of the technological aspects, but also in terms of the works that were adapted. And here we go back to some of the writers Maxim mentioned, kind of the classics of Soviet sci-fi, like Belyaev. And the film based on his kind of cult novel Человек Amphibia, the Amphibian Man, that comes out in the early 60s, and becomes an absolutely kind of cult film, one of the key films of the Thaw, and plays a role in all sorts of ways. For instance, kind of in the gay Soviet underground. And so yes, the kind of the world of Soviet cinematic sci-fi is very, very interesting. But thinking specifically about these writers, no, and it's hard to put Gor's works on screen because they're so kind of serious. And Varshavsky would work wonderfully on screen because he's so inventive and he's so funny and he's so ironic. I think Gromova was very, very serious, but would work wonderfully as well. Again, this book that they wrote together with Nudelman, but Time Travel Institute. I mean, it's Marvel universe. I mean, that's the language that it speaks, and so it would work. It would work so well. Now, kind of, I'm also thinking about bringing translations of these works to the American reader. I think they would find a wide audience. It's interesting that a lot of these, or some of these works, were translated during the Cold War into English, because the Americans were fascinated with the Soviet sci-fi. People like Isaac Asimov and a number of scholars working on sci-fi. They were connection with these authors. Of course, Lem was translated widely. But some of these stories, like Gor stories, were translated. Varshavsky stories were translated. There are all these anthologies of Soviet sci-fi that were coming out in the 1970s. With these wonderful, beautiful illustrations. Strugatskys were translated, and so. But all of those, of course, are out of print and forgotten. So we need new translations, of which there are now many of the Strugatskys works. But of these people, we need more. We're absolutely.
Right. So let me go to the next question. This one is from Hetty Kerner. Do you think there is a relationship between the anti-religious orthodoxy of the USSR and the current self-imposed censorship of people in the West? In some ways, the desire to singularly define identity means someone who doesn't fit the orthodoxies imposed from the top down must retreat into fantasy internet subgroups. Interesting question.
Interesting question.
Not necessarily related to your topic, but
so the question is asking if there's a relationship between sort of retreat into fantasy and
identity, I guess.
Identity. Maybe. I mean, as I said, so in the Soviet context, I think sci-fi was a niche, along with, again, for instance, animation, translation, right, that became sort of a niche for these disaffected intellectuals. Cinema or writing scripts also was sort of, that's what Friedrich Gorenstein was doing publicly, but sometimes not publicly, just doing it for money and his name not appearing in credits. But it's not that they were running. I mean, they had no other choice, right? This is how this is how they survived within kind of this authoritarian environment. I think the culture of today is different. I mean, we have so many identities and so many ways to express different identities and so many ways to form all these, to find places for your identity. And of course, online provides that opportunity. So the contexts are very different.
Yeah, no, and I think something you, Marat, have been writing about really powerfully is the idea that for Soviet Jews, particularly in the post-Stalinist era, sort of niches developed. One of them, as you mentioned, was literary translation. Another was animation. But of course, another one was science fiction. And then there are interesting intersections. For instance, one of the principal translators of American science fiction into Russian was a Jewish writer by the name of Rostislav Rybkin, who actually was himself a victim of repressions, and he had spent a time in a camp in Mordova already after Stalin's death. He was Ray Bradbury's principal translator, and he got to select works of Bradbury's that would be purchased, by the way, for hard currency to be published in the Soviet Union. And for instance, one of the, I don't mean to take over, it's just an interesting example. One of the stories he translated is Bradbury's very famous story, Darling Adolf, which is about a film that is being made in which Hitler has to make a speech at a stadium-like setting. And this actor really becomes Hitler, and all of a sudden thinks that he can now manipulate the crowds and then start carrying out his genocidal scenarios. And this was published in the Soviet Union and spearheaded by a Jewish translator.
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? And that certainly belongs in this context, right? And these intersections, I think, are so interesting in kind of recovering that context and bringing it to life, right? Because again, you think about the Strugatskys working in, of course, being writers, but also working in cinema, and also being in touch with with translators and kind of putting all of this together. So yeah, absolutely.
Good. So we have another very interesting question. This is from Anthony Kalashnikov. How effective was the Soviet censorship apparatus in picking up on themes of Jewishness and cracking down on sci-fi authors and their works? I'm thinking about Vaiskunsky and Lukadyanov's Ur Sin Shama affair, in which their book was attacked for supposedly propagandizing Zionism. Were there other notable cases?
Yes, great question, right? And so a question that I address in my Soviet Jewish bookshelf, but clearly that will be addressed here as well. I mean, the world of Soviet censorship, especially kind of post-Thaw period, is fascinating because it was in a sense so unpredictable, and sometimes it's very hard to understand the logic of why certain things were taken out and why others were left. So to give you a non-sci-fi example, right, and I write about it in my book, in the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. So Kornei Chukovsky wanted to put out stories from the Bible, mainly from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, and have this book. So he was working on it with different translators, for years. And it was ready to go, even though there were stipulations by the censors that word God should not be mentioned, Jews should not be mentioned. God forbid, right? But the work was already, they were ready to print it. And then the 6-Day War happens, and the Soviet censors say, no, now we really cannot talk about these Jews and in the context of the 6-Day War, because mentioning Jerusalem in the context of the 6-Day War takes in a kind of very, very real dimension. So that's destroyed. And so that book was never published. At the same time as this is happening, you still have the publication of the collected volumes of Leon Feuchtwanger and his Josephus trilogy that talks about Jerusalem being at the center of the universe. Yeah, you have also publication of the works by Kosidowski, this Polish writer, who was kind of popularizing, presenting story of the Hebrew Bible in some really wonderful, fascinating terms, using a lot of archaeological evidence and talking absolutely explicitly about the destiny of the Jewish people and the heroism and the beauty of the Jewish people. So how do you explain that? On the one hand, they're saying to Chukovsky, no. On the other hand, all of these other works so kind of the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing. Probably what also played a role that Kosidowski, these are translations from Polish, Feuchtwanger translations from Russian. We can do that, but when it's Chukovsky, right, the great Chukovsky who wants to talk about the Bible, that's a no-no. The same with these sci-fi works. The Strugatskys increasingly had tons of issues with censorship, and this especially happens when this place Молодая Гвардия, this publishing house that was so central for them in the 1960s, turns in a very different direction, right? Becomes much more nationalistic, and in a sense much more anti-Semitic, and also kind of in cahoots with censorship. So some of their major works, like Snail on the Slope, they really could not publish, or The Ugly Swans, or of course the Doomed City. But you look at the other ones, like Monday Begins on Saturday, or this work from 1962 that I mentioned, Escape Attempt, where you have a character who escapes from the Nazi camp and wants to find a planet, where he can hide from them. Originally, they wanted to have their character escape from the Soviet camps, from the Gulag camps, right? So interestingly, in that, right, so in the context of censorship, Holocaust, I mean, this World War II is okay, But through that, they can infuse that Holocaust element. But the Gulag is not. Yeah.
No, this is very true. But also, of course, as Marat, you know very well, there was such a strong tendency to present what happened to Western Jews as the Holocaust. And there were a lot of works dealing with the death camps and the Nazi concentration camps. But what was happening in the Soviet territories was a completely different story. This reminds me of, you know, years ago when I was doing work on ultra-Russian nationalists, I interviewed Stanislav Kunyaev, who is one of the most prominent ultra-nationalists and who is the editor of Nash Современник. And he said to me, do not confuse what happened to our Jews and what happened to Western Jews. What happened to them was the Holocaust, but what happened to our Jews was not. And that's, so, I mean, oddly enough, Молодая Гвардия was really the hotbed of that thinking, starting with the 1970s.
Absolutely.
I really appreciated that.
But it's interesting to think about Молодая Гвардия as kind of this very liberal place in the early 1960s. What I should also mention is that Soviet censorship was kind of this multi-tiered, right? And so until you get to that final sort of party stamp of approval, you had to go through your peers who were doing the work of censorship. But I should say, and I write about it, particularly in my book about the Commissar, Skordov's film, Soviet censors were not idiots, or at least some of them were not idiots. And sometimes when they located, you know, these Jewish innuendos, they were absolutely correct. They were absolutely correct, yeah, and that's true of the Strugatskys, and that's true of the example that the question had, yeah. Or if, you know, Strugatskys were saying, oh, you know, Inhabited Island, you know, their novel that they also had huge difficulty publishing, but that was seen by the censors kind of the Zionist and Jewish, etc. Well, it is, yeah, not in these simplistic terms, but they were right to find kind of these Jewish sort of echoes and elements there. Yeah. On the other hand, we're in the liberal writers, and again, Strugatsky themselves who are saying, you know, what do they want from us? There is nothing like that here. So it's again, context matters here, right? But I think it would be a mistake, which sometimes kind of Western readers of all this sort of commit, is just to throw away everything that the censors did and say, oh no, they just completely, you know, they misunderstood, they just did no. Sometimes they were very, very astute in kind of locating these elements.
Yeah. So perhaps if we could just ask you one more question, Marat, not to overstay our welcome, just perhaps tell us how you became interested in this topic.
Yeah. It's interesting, I think, because as a child, as a teenager, because that's when a lot of these works one would read, I did not read a lot of them, you know. So yeah, as I was reconstructing kind of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf for everybody and thinking about my family's bookshelf, we did not have sci-fi in our bookshelves. And the Strugatskys were really not part of, these were not the books that I grew up with. I did read, again, if you think about Belyaev and Alexei Tolstoy, kind of the classics of Soviet sci-fi, that I absolutely did. But these other works, I came to them later as a scholar, as a mature person, just loving sci-fi in general, both kind of American sci-fi and I think my son, who is 13 now, kind of helped with that. He introduced me to the world of Star Wars and kind of all that on Marvel universe. But I that's not something I grew up with, right? And so it's a later development. But I can absolutely see how, you know, I could have read those books back then, and how my parents and grandparents could have as well. But they had other interests. Yeah. But I think kind of sci-fi, and so Nudelman, this writer, that translator that I mentioned, he wrote this fascinating essay in the early 1960s about why sci-fi matters. It was published officially, et cetera, and he says that in this world where the individual doesn't really have control over anything, and the individual himself, herself loses so much power, and we're subject to these greater forces, it is sci-fi that allows to understand these forces and appreciate them. And we're in this condition to such greater extent than we were in the in the 1960s. That's why I think rediscovering these works, rereading these works would be of enormous value, because they're real bridge between Russian literature, Soviet literature, and Western American literature. And considering the enormous crisis that Russian literature is in today, I think going back to these works and seeing how these writers survived in fighting censorship, survived in this authoritarian atmosphere, really provides a lesson in the survivability of Russian literature and Jewish literature, for that matter.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marat. Thank you, Professor Greenberg, for this wonderful presentation. I personally learned a great deal, and I think our audience members did as well. And we hope to see you again when this project becomes a book. Thanks again, and thank you for being with us. I'm Maxim Schreier, and this was Professor Marat Greenberg speaking about